Well, good afternoon. And good. You can graduate. Let me begin by congratulating then all of you who will receive your degrees tomorrow. Tufts is one of this country's great universities, and you are right to feel proud of all you've accomplished. And I only have one suggestion to make, that you stand up, you turn around, and you thank your friends, your families, and your teachers who helped you get to this day. And by the way, what a glorious day it is. We should all take this as a good omen. So thank you for asking me here to speak at this 2012 Class Day. It's a special treat and honor to be here with your dean and my longtime friend and colleague, Steve Bosworth. And as Steve correctly pointed out, he and I now go back more than 30 years. We literally traveled the world together. And I'm glad to report to you that the world, as well as the two of us, survived. Steve is the consummate professional in two ways, both in what he has done and how he has done it. He's someone who has excelled as a diplomat, and he's done it diplomatically. And I say that just to point out that the two do not always go hand in hand. Now, I understand the commencement talks usually follow a script, and the speaker tries to provide guidance for life beyond campus. And for better or worse, though, I wasn't asked to do that. I was asked to speak about foreign policy. And I will speak about foreign policy, but for the record, in case you were hoping for a traditional commencement talk, don't be afraid to fail. Listen more than talk, and focus on the journey and not the destination. But I digress. Now, often when I'm asked to speak at events on a campus, an explicit or implicit theme of all that I say is that the world matters. But there's no need to do that today, given that this is one of the few institutions in this country preparing young men and women for a career in foreign affairs and international relations. And I expect you all understood how much the world matters in choosing to go here, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, or on the off chance you didn't know, now you do. So given this focus, it's tempting for me to speak to you about some esoteric topic, be it the challenge of global governance, or the competing purposes of American foreign policy, or how best to balance the instruments of statecraft. But as often as best, I will resist temptation. Now, don't worry. The wisdom of resisting temptation will not be the subject of my remarks today. If only because I expect that horse has left the barn, at least for some of you in attendance today. Well, I thought that would get more laughter. So instead, I'll talk about what I judge to be the greatest threat to order in the world. No, I'm not talking about terrorism or a rising China or global climate change or nuclear proliferation or poverty or pandemic disease or upheavals in the Arab world. Although these and other phenomena are obviously worth contemplating and contending with. Rather, my greatest worry concerns another kind of threat, namely, that the United States is losing its willingness and its ability to continue playing a leading, make that the leading role on the world stage. A great deal's at stake. The world does not operate on autopilot. There's no invisible hand guiding the geopolitical or global economic marketplace. What countries and those who lead them say and do, and what they fail to say and fail to do, have great effect. No country in the world is more significant than the United States. This is not hubris or boasting or chauvinism. It's a simple fact. The United States remains the world's preponderant military power. It accounts for between 1/5 and 1/4 of world economic output. American creations, from the airplane to Apple, from the telephone to Twitter, have had and continue to have enormous global impact. But American importance also relates to American influence. And I expect all of you understand power and influence are related, but they're also fundamentally different. Power is about capability. Influence is something else. It's about the ability to translate that capability so that others act in ways deemed to be desirable. The era of American primacy, the era of profound American influence, now goes back more than half a century to World War II. It has been defined not just by economic and military might, but by an ability to get things done. Think about it. Much of the world's institutional architecture would simply not exist without American leadership and commitment. The same holds for the rules and principles that shape relations between countries and for expectations as to how governments ought to behave within their borders. If the United States were to do less, either out of choice or a lack of capacity, it would have great consequence. Other countries are rarely prepared to step into the breach. Many simply lack the means. Few have developed habits of leadership. Most are focused internally or locally. Regional and international institutions often lack the necessary consensus, capacity, or legitimacy. Worse yet, other countries are non-state actors, ranging from terrorist cells to drug cartels, would take advantage of any American abdication of global leadership. Their goal would not be to create order, but to undermine it. But don't get me wrong, the United States is far from always being right in what it does or how it does it. At times we've gotten our priorities wrong. In recent years in Iraq and in the Afghan surge, I would argue the United States has erred by attempting to do too much in pursuing ill-advised wars of choice. On occasion, we may also have erred by trying to do too little. Clearly, choosing the right ends and balancing these ends with limited means is no easy feat. So my point for you this morning is not that the United States is perfect, but rather that its leadership, for now and for the foreseeable future, is essential if the world is to be largely peaceful, largely prosperous, and largely open. And what worries me, and what I want to talk to you about, are the challenges to American leadership. Challenges that are coming less from without than from within. What I want to do is focus on three of these challenges. The first is economic. The United States has accumulated a federal debt of some $15 trillion, roughly equal to 1 year's GDP. And we are adding to this debt at a rate well above $1 trillion a year. It was Herb Stein, one of Richard Nixon's principal economic advisors, who once observed that things that cannot go on forever will end. Well, this will end. The world will grow weary and wary of lending more dollars to the United States and will demand higher returns for so doing. And the danger then is twofold. At a minimum, it will force the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates, in the process dampening economic growth that is already below historic averages. But at worst, all this will happen suddenly, forcing draconian and ill-considered cuts in what it is we can spend. We can avoid this fate. We can avoid it, but only if we take steps to put our domestic house in order. The Simpson-Bowles Commission suggested one way forward. Something like it is called for if we, the United States, are to have the resources that are necessary to remain a world power. If we are to be able to shield ourselves from the pressures of markets or unfriendly central banks. And also important, if we are to present the model of political and economic competence that the world will want to emulate. Eliminating the economic deficit is not necessary, but it does need to be reduced. This can be accomplished responsibly, largely through reductions in what is spent on entitlements, but also on defense and selected domestic programs. Tax reform is also essential. I, for one, favor emphasizing spending cuts and some increase in taxes. But these increases in taxes need not come from higher tax rates. A better approach, I would suggest, would include phasing out so-called tax expenditures, such as mortgage deductions, for those who don't need them, and instituting both a fair estate tax and some form of consumption tax. Perhaps more important are policies that bolster government revenues through increased economic growth. It is time, I would suggest, to move beyond the increasingly sterile debate between austerity and stimulus. We need to put growth at the center of the American economic debate. And I would advocate, for example, the reduction of trade barriers, altering corporate taxation to encourage investment at home, and increasing the ability of the most talented people from around the world, from overseas, to come to the United States to study, to work, to live, and work here. The second domestic challenge facing us is infrastructure. 10 years ago, just a decade ago, American infrastructure ranked 5th in the world in terms of quality. A decade later, it now ranks 24th, passed by the likes of Barbados, Malaysia, and Oman. The United States spends just under $50 billion a year on surface transportation, but to maintain what we have and make necessary improvements, we'll need to more than double that. Continuing down this road, so to speak, will have measurable effects, and I'm not talking just about potholes. By 2020, that's only 8 years from now, crumbling infrastructure could shave a full percentage point off this country's growth. That's a staggering amount when you consider that the economy only averaged 2% growth during the first decade of this century. Fixing or modernizing the country's airports, its rail system, its bridges, roads, ports, and electrical grid is not something that can be done quickly or cheaply, but it must be done. There is no reason, however, that the government need provide the bulk of the resources for doing this. Public-private partnerships, such as a national infrastructure bank, could seed and coordinate the projects, with the bulk of the resources coming from others and paid back by user fees or return on investment. The fact that such projects would also create jobs for many Americans is an important added benefit. The third domestic challenge I want to face us appropriately and want to mention facing us is education. America's great private universities, including this one, are truly world-class. But the kindergarten through 12th grade system that supplies them is in deep, deep trouble. In recent international tests, American students ranked 14th in the world in reading, 25th in the world in math, and 17th in science. Just 1/3, 1 out of every 3 of elementary school students in this country is competent in reading and math. Some 25% will not graduate high school. A recent Council on Foreign Relations sponsored task force warned that this situation jeopardizes not just America's prosperity, but it jeopardizes this country's national security. The quality of public education needs to improve markedly if we are to produce the young men and women we will need who can compete successfully in a global marketplace, who can staff this government and this society, who can fulfill their obligations as citizens. The good news, and as is often the case, the good news is that the answer is not about spending more. It's about spending smarter. Resources need to be directed to the poorest communities. National standards in literacy, math, science, and also civics should be developed and introduced. Teacher training and accountability are essential. Please don't get me wrong. The United States is not, repeat not, in decline. As I said earlier, it is the world's largest economy, its most powerful fighting force, and its greatest innovator. And the United States can still point to extraordinary strengths, including flexible labor and capital markets, new finds of natural gas and oil that promise to transform the country's energy future, fertile land, ample water, a growing population that both avoids the bulges of either too many young people or too many aged, and appropriate today, and as I already mentioned, are world-class institutions of higher learning. And at the same time, other countries are not without their problems. Europe, with a collective economy roughly the same size as this one, is experiencing what promises to be a prolonged financial and potentially political crisis. And even if this crisis is somehow resolved, Europe faces a difficult future, given its lack of labor mobility, unaffordable entitlements, an aging population, and regulatory and immigration policies that inhibit economic growth. China, for its part, faces growing political uncertainty, environmental degradation, and the need to put into place a new economic model, one that depends less on exports and much more on domestic consumption. India must tackle massive poverty and political deadlock. Japan, for its part, has weathered 2 decades of drift, but unfortunately, there's no end in sight. And Russia is a largely one-dimensional economy, overly dependent on raw materials. Its population is shrinking. Its politics are brittle. But the weaknesses and problems of others comes as no source of relief. The risk in this foreseeable future, the risk in the world you will enter, is not the emergence of a peer competitor to the United States, but rather the absence of partners for the United States, partners who are willing and able to work with us in a world defined by global threats that require collaborative responses. More important, the weaknesses of other countries should not distract Americans from the need to address this country's shortcomings. I would urge us to pursue what I call a policy of restoration, a policy based on restoring this country's strength and replenishing its economic, human, and physical resources. But please understand me, this is not to say the United States should wall itself off from the world, far from it. In an era of globalization, isolationism would fail to protect us from global threats and would also deny us the opportunity to help build a more open and peaceful world. Rather, a policy of restoration would acknowledge that foreign policy is not so foreign after all, but to the contrary, even foreign policy must begin at home. A good friend of mine who led another university not far from here kept 3 boxes on his desk: in, out, and too hard. The good news is that none of the many challenges facing this country, including the 3 I've highlighted here today, none of these challenges need go into that 3rd box, into that too hard box. None is beyond fixing. The only question is whether our politics are up to it. I hope they are, because not just the future of this country, but the next year of history in the world depend on it. And I hope and trust that you, the Fletcher class of 2012, will be part of that process. So thank you again for asking me to speak here today. Good luck and God bless.